Arte y Cultura para la Paz presenta Primer Foro, Ideas para la Paz, Guatemala. Jackeline Bonds, Bioquímica, estudios de neurociencia, Universidad de San Diego. ¿Cómo influye el arte y la cultura en nuestro cerebro?
Hi, thank you so much for allowing me to speak today. I wish that I were able to be physically present to talk with you, but hopefully this video will enlighten you on how our brain works and how art and culture can change our brains for the better. My name is Jackeline Bonds, and I am a predoctoral fellow at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I am an instructor of neuroscience at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I am very excited to share my knowledge of the brain with you. The questions I hope to answer for you today are, 1, how do the cells of our brain communicate with one another? This is very important if we want to understand how the brain works. 2nd, how does our brain control and regulate emotion and empathy? And 3rd, how is the creation or viewing of art able to promote peace and hopefully alleviate violence in our cultures? Now, an important thing to remember is that our brains are the last organ to develop after birth, and also that it develops from the bottom up or the inside out. What I mean to say by this is that the most important parts of our brain develop first, those that are involved with regulating our automatic functions such as heart rate, respiratory rate, vascular tone, and digestion. In other words, the functions that we wouldn't cognitively think about. Then, after these parts have successfully developed, we're able to move on to the more complex and plastic or modifiable parts of our brains that are involved with forming our personalities, our decision-making, and our emotions. Once we are born, our brains are waiting for experiences to develop. We're like sponges, soaking up all of the information the world has to offer us. And what we experience has a lot to do with the culture in which we are raised and the environment to which we are exposed. I hope to convince you by the end of this talk that exposure to art and culture can physically change our brains. And more importantly, I hope to convince you that the creation and exposure to art can at least in part help to rehabilitate violent offenders and give voice to the parts of ourselves that we cannot communicate with words. So let's start with what our brains are made of. Our brains are composed of millions of cells that function to reconstruct the reality that we live in. And it does this through the input of information from all of our sensory systems such as vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. The main and most important cell of the brain is the neuron. The neuron is a seemingly simple yet very complex cell, and each neuron is connected to another neuron through a structure called a synapse. These synapses far outnumber any other cell type or structure that we have in the brain and are therefore very important in how our brains function. Now, the most interesting fact about neurons and their synapses is that they are plastic. And what I mean to say by this is that they're able to change throughout our lifetime, not just when we were young. Our brains can physically change. This is a process known as neuroplasticity. So how do these cells communicate with one another? Well, without going into too much detail, our neurons communicate with one another using small chemicals known as neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters act as messengers between one cell and the next. And an interesting fact about these neurotransmitters is that they are generally localized to a specific area of the brain and are responsible for determining how we respond to our environment and our experiences. For instance, when we experience pleasure, we are experiencing the release of dopamine. Dopamine is one of the strongest neurotransmitters of the brain because it can quite literally direct, regulate, and control our behaviors. In every action we take, it is our brain's hope that it will increase the amount of dopamine in our synapses, thereby giving rise to pleasure and reward. There are more neurons that produce dopamine than any other type of modulatory or regulatory neurotransmitter in the brain. Now, there are two areas of the brain that produce dopamine, but the one we are most interested in today is the ventral tegmental area. This area is important because it sends projections to several other areas of the brain involved with motivation and reward, such as the hippocampus, the part of our brain responsible for learning and memory, the amygdala, the part of our brain that processes emotion and fear, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that forms our personalities and our decision-making. There are two other neurotransmitters that are very important when we're talking about the experience of pleasure, and these are oxytocin and vasopressin. These two neurotransmitters work in concert with one another and are important for mating and parental behavior, but more generally, they're important for social cognition, social behavior, and our ability to read the minds and intentions of others. Both oxytocin and vasopressin are made within a structure of the brain called the hypothalamus. Oxytocin and vasopressin enhance a person's social interactions by increasing relaxation, trust, empathy, and altruism. When given to people or released in our brains, it greatly reduces the activation of the amygdala, the part of our brain that processes fear. It also appears to enhance positive communication by decreasing the amount of stress hormones in our brains. These neurotransmitters are thus extremely important for the development and regulation of human behavior. So how do our brains regulate or produce emotion and empathy? And why is this important when talking about the effect that art and culture has on our brains? Well, by developing insights into the biology and cognitive psychology of perception, emotion, and empathy, we can start to understand how and why art moves us so powerfully. And also, we can begin to understand how emotion can direct our behaviors as individuals and ultimately as a society. We can start to understand how art and culture can change our brains. To begin to understand how our brain regulates or produces emotion, it is important to understand what we know so far about how our brains respond to our environment. From there, we can begin to understand the effect that art and culture has on our brains. To begin to address the first question, I would like to tell you about the limbic system. The limbic system is comprised of several brain structures that work together to produce and regulate emotion and empathy. These structures are the hippocampus, the part of our brain responsible for learning and memory, the amygdala, the part of our brain that processes fear, the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for our personalities and decision-making, the ventral tegmental area, the part of our brain that produces dopamine for motivation and reward, and the hypothalamus, the part of our brain responsible for the production and release of several modulatory or regulatory neurotransmitters such as oxytocin and vasopressin. Now, this function of the hypothalamus makes it one of the most important parts of the brain when talking about the integration of the emotional response. In fact, studies have shown that injuries to this particular part of the brain, the hypothalamus, can result in inexplicable rage and produce violent behaviors. However, it is the individual connections between all of these structures of the brain that produce emotion and empathy, and dysfunction in any one of these areas, either by injury or deficient neurotransmitter release, can produce violent behaviors. But I have great news. When we view or create a work of art, we are engaging all of those areas of the brain that I just mentioned. We are increasing blood flow and stimulating the release of neurotransmitters, and this can help heal or restore those areas of the brain that have been compromised by injury or exposure to damaging stimuli such as violence or trauma. Remember, our brains are plastic. They are able to change in response to our environment. So what is it about art that allows us to reach these deep areas of our brains? Well, the first thing that happens when we view a piece of art is the activation of the visual centers of our brains. From there, the part of our brain that is active when viewing a piece of art is the medial prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is extremely important when considering the emotional response and the reward pathway. It is this part of the brain that is common to the experience of beauty in both art and music, and is thus critical in forming our perceptions about our environment. This part of the brain is also important in the formation of our personalities and decision-making processes. Okay, so why is why is it important when considering how art can alleviate violence and perhaps promote peace? Well, studies have shown that violent offenders often have deficits in that very same area of the brain that I had just mentioned, the prefrontal cortex. But remember, our brains are plastic. They can physically change. We can change the way we think and behave if given the opportunity and in the right environment. So what do I mean by environment? Well, I work in a research lab that studies a process called neurogenesis, or the creation of new neurons. What we know so far is that neurogenesis can be stimulated through exercise and environmental enrichment. And when I say exercise, I am not only talking about physical exercise, running, jumping, playing football. I am also talking about mental exercises that can increase blood flow to critical regions of the brain. And art can do this. Remember, viewing or creating a piece of art stimulates not only the visual centers of our brains, but also those involved in the regulation of emotion and empathy through the limbic system, all of those structures I had mentioned to you before. By increasing blood flow to those areas of the brain, we are restoring communication between those neurons and increasing the release of neurotransmitters. We are increasing the amount of dopamine, of oxytocin, of vasopressin in our brains, and thus experiencing pleasure and relaxation. We are altering brain functions and thus contributing to changes in social behaviors, and these actions can stimulate the formation of new synapses where new habits, new memories, and new experiences can be programmed and restored. Art enriches our environment in very unique ways. And this in turn stimulates the generation of new neurons in our brains. This is not a theory, but a fact. Our brains can physically change in response to our environment. And by enriching our environment through art, we can make new neurons, which can then ultimately change a person and therefore change the society that we live in. Exposure to art and culture can help restore the function to areas of the brain known to be compromised in individuals who are more prone to violence. This is how we can hope to promote peace in our societies. We must make our environment rich with things we can see, touch, and hear. All of these things will act on our brains to physically change it for the better, and thereby making it easier for us to communicate with one another, to trust one another, and to be more empathetic, and ultimately make our experiences in different environments and cultures more pleasurable. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope to answer any and all questions you may have about the impact of art and culture in our brains. Thank you.
Ahorita nos regresamos con Jackie otra vez para que hagan las preguntas que ustedes necesiten hacer. Vanessa, gracias al señor que está aquí, ella es científica también y entiende esto. Solo le pedía que nos hiciera un resumen de un minuto para que cachemos la profundidad de lo que Jackie explica.
Bueno, fue mucha información, pero voy a tratar de resumirla. Básicamente habló de la plasticidad cerebral también y de la habilidad que tiene el arte y la cultura en formar o adaptar el cerebro a formar estas nuevas sinapsis que van a, en ciertas áreas del cerebro, van a permitir la empatía, la disminución del miedo, todo lo del sistema límbico, la amígdala y todo eso que les platiqué yo antes también, como esto también puede ser para bien, para poder estimular esas áreas del cerebro por medio de arte y de cultura y de belleza y de todo lo bueno y el aprendizaje que podamos tener para aumentar la capacidad de empatía, inteligencia emocional, sentimientos de felicidad. O sea que, en pocas palabras, hay esperanza gracias a esta plasticidad que tenemos en el cerebro.
Hi.
We're going to open to some questions.
Okay, great.
Primero, felicitaciones por el resumen tan bueno. Y más que una pregunta, es un comentario, cómo ya estando la solución para digamos, hacer sistemas educativos que estén en lugar de concentrados en matemáticas e idiomas, deberían estar concentrados en el arte, porque ya con propuestas como estas nos dice que ahí está la respuesta a una sociedad más civilizada, más amable, más amorosa y más empática. Entonces, solo gracias, para mí es que ella tendría que presentarle esta presentación a los gobiernos sistemas educativos.
Jackie, she was saying congratulations for the information, and that now that we have all the facts and we know this information, we should share this with politicians, with educators, so we can center our education in programs that allow education in art and culture and so forth. So it's more a comment, not a question, but she says thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Esperamos invitar a Jackie a ir a Guate porque es importante que estas cosas se sepan. Miren, ya probamos mucho de lo mismo y lo hemos probado 1000 veces. ¿Desde cuando el sistema educativo no se reforma en nuestros países? Entonces, ya es hora de comenzar a abrirnos al mundo y dejar de ser medievales o de medievales que hemos sido siempre. ¿Verdad? ¿Alguien más?
Sí, tenemos un problema en el arte que hemos venido percibiendo desde hace algunos años a esta parte, que ha sido una manifestación artística, podríamos llamar, degenerativa, o sea, que ha perdido completamente la estética y manifiesta de una u otra manera formas de violencia, formas de sus colores, en sus expresiones, tanto literarias como pictóricas. Representa violencia, representa la frustración de la sociedad. Mi pregunta es si ese arte degenerado que causa a veces hasta un poquito de repugnancia al contemplarlo, si funciona de la misma manera que las bellas artes. Gracias.
Okay, Jackie, his question is that now that we see art, sometimes we can see art that expresses violence, that expresses like hard messages, that sometimes is like gut-wrenching to see, that it's an expression of what we see actually. Does it have the same effect that you were talking about as other types of art, like ballet or things that are not as grotesque?
Well, I think the answer to that would be yes, in a short answer. I think when we see art that expresses violence or that expresses that grotesqueness that we're not really able to see in other forms of art, really gets out that frustration that the artist may feel and allows other people who are viewing that art to relate to it and know that they can express themselves in that way. Yeah, I'm not quite sure if that answers.
Okay, thank you. La respuesta es sí, porque es una forma de expresar arte, de expresar a esta persona que va a ayudar con todos esos procesos que ella platicó, y va a ayudar a las personas que están haciendo ese arte a expresarse y a las personas que están viendo ese arte a poder relacionarse al mismo.
Una cosa, seguramente mucha gente está pensando, ¿por qué arte si la gente tiene hambre? Hay que darle comida y salud. ¿Saben qué pasa? La gente tiene derecho al arte, tiene derecho a la belleza. No puede ser que nosotros pretendamos darle a comer a una persona, pero cuando sale de su casa lo único que está expuesta a escenas de violencia. ¿Quién va a querer vivir así? ¿Verdad? Entonces es un derecho humano también el arte y la belleza.
Gracias. Bueno, yo quisiera saber si hay algún texto, documento o existe un programa que yo pueda seguir de cómo aplicar el arte a la inteligencia emocional. Algo que me pueda recomendar, por favor, algún texto, algún programa que ya esté hecho.
Okay.
Para yo poder implementarlo en talleres.
Okay. Jackie, she's saying if you have any recommendations of like published information or books or whatever that she can read to implement these ideas in like education or workshops with people?
Yes, a good publication is by Kandel. It's called The Age of Insight, A Quest to Understanding the Unconscious Through Art. Kandel is the father of neuroscience, and this book does a really good job at explaining the link between art, artists, and the conversation they should be having with scientists.
Dice que hay una publicación de Kandel, que es como el padre de la neurociencia, y esta información habla sobre qué efectos tiene el arte sobre la función cerebral y la neurogénesis, que se lo recomienda para leerlo. Ahora voy a entrar yo, en cuanto a esta información específica, sobre talleres específicos, sí existe, está en varios lugares, puede buscarlos incluso en Google, porque hay muchísimos. También hay varias psicólogos especializados en neurociencia que tienen ya estos talleres, que podría ser algo de utilidad.
Bueno, mi pregunta es de que si actualmente existe un programa que se haya visto que sí funcione con personas que han estado en la cárcel y que se les pueda reintegrar a la sociedad, o sea, de que se comprueba que ya son personas que ya pueden convivir bien, ¿verdad? O sea, que se les haya aplicado dentro de la cárcel o después de la cárcel.
She's asking if there's any scientific data of studies with people that have been in jail, or programs that they have had in jails that can give some insight on how these people actually became better for elements of society. If there's any studies published about it.
I know there are several studies that have been published about art being used in jail. I can't recall any specific ones, but I'm sure I can find them and forward them on to Vanessa, who can then provide that information to you. I can't think of any off the top of my head at the moment.
Okay. Sé que sí existen, hay programas documentados usados en las cárceles, que no tiene ahorita los nombres exactos, pero que puede buscarlos y enviarlos a Vanessa para subirlos a la página y que puedan verlos.
I have a question. Art is very linked to emotions, and since we're kids, we're taught not to cry and basically not to show these emotions. How do you think we can teach children and adolescents to channel their emotions to art, especially in a culture like in Guatemala, when you've never been involved to art in our society?
He's asking that as adolescents and as kids, sometimes they are not allowed to cry or to show these emotions. So how can, okay?
How do you think we can teach children and adolescents to channel their emotions to art?
How can we teach children and teens to channel their emotions through art, specifically in places like Guatemala where there's not a lot of art appreciation?
Well, that's where I think art education becomes really important. It's difficult to say without being familiar with the educational system in Guatemala, but I really think that the way to do that is to continue to promote art as a valid subject in school. I know that here in the States, there isn't a lot of funding for art and music education, so we must continue to fight for the right to have the funding for that, and give art legitimacy in the educational system.
Thank you. Lo traduzco para los demás. Habla sobre, no conoce muy bien cómo es la educación aquí en Guatemala, por lo cual no podría dar una respuesta específica, pero puede hablar sobre Estados Unidos y que sabe que hay poca cantidad de dinero invertida en arte y que tenemos que seguir luchando para que legitimizar esta educación para que sea accesible para todos los adolescentes y niños en nuestros países.
Well, Jackie, thank you very much. I think this is it. I know. Thank you.
A big round of applause for Jackie, please. Thank you, Jackie.
Muchas gracias.
Have a nice day. Thank you for all the information. See you
You
later.
too.
See you next time here in Guatemala.
Okay, yes, absolutely.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bueno, ¿por qué comenzamos con eso?
Respecto al arte, pero quien no ha experimentado el arte no puede tener ni idea de los efectos renovadores. Cuando ustedes hablan con los artistas y les preguntan que por qué se dedican al arte, porque los salvó. A mucha gente la salva del suicidio, la salva de la soledad, de ser incompatible con la sociedad. Lo que sucede es que no nos han prohibido el derecho al arte.
o nos han hecho creer que el artista es marihuanero, homosexual, comunista, que es vago, desocupado. Siempre cuento la historia de un muchacho en El Salvador que él componía canciones súper lindas en su hamaca. Le habían grabado en el pueblo el borbojo desocupado, por comparar con las patillas. O sea, y el tipo es un artista, pero lo que sucede, que no se oye. Bueno, lo que sucede, si me oyen más. Sí, va. Pues sí, lo que sucede es que tenemos que reivindicar el arte y creer en el poder sanador del arte. Bueno, aquí tenemos a una persona que trabaja en neurología, ¿me entienden? Yo no creo que la matemática haga eso por nadie. Claro, es maravillosa y es excelente, pero no creo que, como decía Silvia, tantas horas de matemática. Hay que tener cuidado con el deporte. La gente siempre habla del deporte como una forma de calmar a los jóvenes. El deporte es entrenamiento para la guerra y eso nunca se dice. Cuando tú pones a dopantes a competir, que está bien como entretención, pero no es cierto que te va a generar jóvenes más tranquilos. El arte tiene otras capacidades de empatizar a nivel cerebral, o sea, de generar empatía a nivel cerebral.
Con el apoyo de Fundación País, Arte Centro Graciela Andrade de País, Convivimos, USAID, Mercy Corps, Fe y Alegría, Flaxo, Fundaespro y EPADES.